Welcome back. It's Saturday and I am working on sanding the hull. Pretty much I've gotten the initial sanding done, and I'll start with the centerboard trunk. I did end up putting a layer of fiberglass over these corners. Some areas it worked, to fold in the hull glass into the trunk, but other areas it didn't work and I just gave up, and I came back and added another piece, and I used some peel ply to make it smooth. So you can see I put a piece here and a piece here about halfway up. So I do have a piece of glass rolled over this edge, and I'm gonna sand it a little smooth. The board tapers, so you really only need to worry about the front, 18 inches or so being nice and smooth. The rest, the board should never really touch that edge because of the taper in the board. So that's the trunk, and you also want to be careful not to dribble epoxy down in there. I had a few drips, but it's not too bad to sand them out. Okay, the hull, my fairing compound worked really well. There's only a couple spots where I didn't put on enough fairing compound. Otherwise, I don't think I've probably only hit glass in a couple of spots. You can kind of pick them out if you look. The parts that are really dark, you can see that's starting to sand into fiberglass, whereas this is clearly still the microspheres. So you can kind of go by the color as to how thick it is and how deep you can go when you're sanding. And I've left the chines alone. I'm going to sand those last, and that helps you just to keep the edges even. And so I've just kept the sander on this plane here and that plane there, and then I'm going to come back and sand the chines by hand with a short block. And I've been sanding with a combination of a sanding board and the half sheet orbital vibratory sander. Okay, this is my sanding board that I made. It's just a piece of 1/4 inch plywood, and this is a full sheet of sandpaper cut in half and spray adhesived onto there, and some hot glued blocks for handles. And I've used this to do the actual fairing, and mostly I've only used it in the bow sections where there's a lot of curvature, and also along this joint where my fiberglass overlapped. Everywhere else I've pretty much just used my Makita half sheet sander, which is this one, which is a really nice sander. I can highly recommend the B04900V model, and I've got it set up with dust extraction, kind of homemade dust extraction, and that goes to our shop vac, and I've recently upgraded it to a Cyclone, which I've always wanted but never had time to make, and I found this one on Amazon for $20, I think, and it came from China, I'm sure, and I stuck it on this 5-gallon bucket today. Is the first time I've been using it. It works really good. No dust in the shop vac. It's all going into here, plenty of suction, but my 5-gallon bucket is starting to implode, so I need to reinforce it somehow. And so I'm sort of I've got some wood stuck in there to keep it from imploding, but that's another project. So most of the hull has been sanded with the half sheet sander with 80 grit sandpaper, and I can kind of tell just by feeling the surface how fair it is, and you can also tell by the color of the microspheres. If you have a high spot, it's going to be whiter with more microspheres, like maybe this spot versus that spot might be a low. And over here I did some testing with my guide coat. This is my guide coat material. It's just denatured alcohol with some blue food coloring, but you can use any color. And I wiped that down on the hull here after I went over it with the half sheet sander, And then I went over it a few times with the sanding board, and that shows some lows and highs still in this surface, and you can feel them if you run your hand over it, just barely. You can feel them. These are actually shallow enough that they'll be taken care of with the primer. But this area here where I overlapped my glass, I wish I had not overlapped it that much. It could have just been, you know, a quarter of an inch really, because I sanded over that with my sanding board until it was smooth, and I just did it by feel when the bump was pretty much gone. And so that took a little time. And you can see I've got a few low spots here and there where it's still glossy. You don't want to, you know, dig down to get those. It's better to just fill them in. And also, when you sand with a half sheet sander, I like the half sheet sander because it just vibrates. It doesn't rotate. You don't want to sand the hull with a random orbital sander. You will not end up with a very fair hull. At least the half sheet sander is 11 inches long, so you know you can, to some extent, you can fair the boat a little bit. But anything like these kind of lows, this low here is about 3 inches wide. You're not going to be able to fair this area with the half sheet sander. You have to use a sanding board. And so like I was saying, I can kind of tell by feel how fair it is and whether or not I can just go at it with the half sheet sander, or if I need to get out the sanding board and do some actual fairing. And when I do my primer, again, this is just the microspheres. When I prime the boat, especially on the top sides where it's highly visible, I'll be using pretty much the board sander exclusively to get a very fair surface. The bottom I'm not too concerned about. I can see that and I can feel that it's pretty fair, and I'll probably be happy with just a half sheet sanded finish on the bottom. But the top side's definitely where I'm going to have my glossy topside paint. I'm going to do the final sanding of the primer with a sanding board. And when I'm using the half sheet sander, you don't want to work it in one spot and then work it in another spot. You want to move it in long passes. I like to go on the diagonal all the way from the chine to the keel, back and forth, working my way down the length of the hull, and then I'll go in the other direction, the back and forth, and that just sands everything evenly. You don't want to, you know, work one spot way down and then go over here and work this spot way down. You'll make it even less fair. The half sheet sander is really just smoothing. It's a difference between smoothing and fairing. Smoothing is, you know, this surface is still slightly unfair, but it's smooth. But when you hit it with the board sander, you can see that it still has some low spots and some high spots, but the half sheet sander just follows those contours. So hopefully that makes sense. And okay, the other thing I did finally decided on was my keel strip. I've been agonizing over the keel strip because, I don't know, I wanted to do something different. This is what I ended up doing. I just did it. It is 5 layers of 2-inch wide fiberglass tape, and it doesn't show much on the camera, but it's about 1/8 of an inch thick, not quite 1/8 of an inch thick. And I stopped it there, and I tapered the layers back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But tapered the layers back, so there's no need for it to go any farther than that. And this is going to be hollow back, and I can run my hollow back maybe to about here, my 1/2 inch wide hollow back, and then from here I can decide if I'm going to do 3/4 hollow back or nothing. Haven't decided yet. But this is what I did. Why did I do this? So there's nothing wrong with the wooden keel strip. I think the primary reason I did this is twofold. One, I'm in a hurry, so I don't want to wait. I didn't want to wait to glue the keel strip on, then shape it, then coat it, and before I can prime. This way I can sand this and then prime it. And the other reason is I just wanted to do something different that didn't have solid wood in it for the keel strip. And so I don't know if this is going to be better, hopefully not worse, but that's kind of the primary reasons. I think this is still going to give plenty of protection from the trailer rollers, which is one consideration. It won't give as good a protection from, you know, pulling the boat up on a sandy beach, although, you know, sand is not too bad. Obviously, you're not going to be pulling the boat up on rocks, and we don't have rocks around here. And so, anyway, that's what I did. We'll see how it goes. My other thinking was that I could always add a keel strip on top of this, but if I put a keel strip on, then I was unlikely to ever try this. So this is an alternate method, and we're going to see how it goes. Like I said, it's 2-inch wide fiberglass tape, and there's 5 layers. And I just stretched them on dry and then wetted them out with a paintbrush, one right after the other, and then I went in with a putty knife and I cleaned up the edges. I also rolled it with an air roller to roll out the bubbles. So once this tacks up, I'll paint a coat of microspheres, the same putty material that is on the hull, on top of that so I can smooth it. So that's my keel strip. And the next thing I've been doing is my transom. I did end up putting a layer of glass on the transom earlier this week, and also the layer of microspheres. It's already been sanded. It's nice and smooth. And you can see the corners are still unsanded. They're still kind of glossy. So I'm going to come back and do those. I wrapped my glass all the way on the inside of the transom. And this is the transom beam here. I added a block on either side of the transom beam, so this full width here is a full inch thick with 10-ounce glass on both sides. That's nice and strong now for my lower rudder hardware, and you'll remember my cutout. We're going to give that a try shortly here when we get the boat wet with the outboard to see if this stays above the water and lets the prop wash and stuff come out the back of the boat. These edges here are still rounded over from when I glassed the hull, so that's my other job today. I'm going to sand these edges down, and I'm going to put a little fence along the transom, and I'm going to sharpen this corner with a combination of thickened epoxy and fiberglass toes, which is basically just long strands of fiberglass that I'm going to push down into that corner like kind of like a rope. I've also done these with chopped strand glass, where you just take some fiberglass and chop it into little short little like 1/16 inch long fibers, and mix that in with your epoxy. And the reason you do that is to give a binder in the epoxy so it's not as brittle, and just makes a little bit of a stronger corner. And so we're sharpening this corner so that when the boat's moving fast, the water can run cleanly off the back, and it won't have a tendency to try to roll up onto the transom, which causes drag. Okay, fast forward, and I've gotten the edge of the transom sharpened off with fiberglass toes, like I said. And the way I did that was I took a scrap of plywood with some packing tape, and I pressed that up against the transom, and I just used some props pushing off of my wall into the plywood, and that held it against the transom, so I didn't have to put any screws or anything on the transom. You could attach it with like hot melt glue or something too. And so then after that's set up, I sanded it with a flat sander from both directions, and it's kind of hard to see. See if I can get it to focus, but I've got a really sharp edge. I'm probably not going to keep it that sharp, but I might, just to try it out. And then I've come back in and filled in the corners with some microspheres and some tape to hold that in place. So once that cures, I'll sand that to finish off these corners. And I've also got the keel strip has been coated with microspheres now, and it's ready for sanding. And so pretty much the boat is ready for a final sanding and then primer. And the only other thing I'm going to do is tape off along here for where my rub rail is going to go, because I don't want to get primer under where I'm going to glue my rub rail. I did decide to go with a wooden rub rail. I was debating whether or not to use a starboard rub rail, which we've done for some boats. The biggest problem is with the 20 Mark III, you know, this is where the rub rail would go. And in that location, it's just 1/4-inch plywood. So there's nothing to screw into in this length. So I would need to glue another strip of wood on the inside, which that's shown in the plans. And that would allow me to screw into. What I'm going to try to do, or what I'm going to do, is simply glue my rub rail onto the hull. I guess I was showing you the wrong spot. Oh no, I wasn't. It's confusing because it's upside down. I'm going to just glue my rub rail onto the hull. I'll probably use a few screws to hold it in place, but then I will take those screws out, and then I can do the hollow back on the rub rails. And this way I can just avoid adding additional wood pieces to the inside in here, but also in the cabin. And then on another note, on the 20 Mark III, doing the stainless steel hollow back down the keel line, with the way that I've done it, if I wanted to do that, I would have to screw into my ballast tank. And an option there is to go ahead and install the hollow back now before I have the cockpit sole glued in, and that way when I flip the boat upright, I will be able to see where all those screws stick through into the ballast tank, and I can just sand around them and create a little blob of epoxy, and I can even put a piece of fiberglass over that if I want. So essentially sealing those screw locations off from the ballast tank. If you had already glued the cockpit sole down, then you kind of wouldn't have the option of screwing into that at all. And if you do an external keel strip like it's shown in the plans, then you could just screw into that to hold the hollow back in place. So just another thing to consider if you're thinking about doing it this way. And so while I got the boat upside down, I think I'll also give you a quick tour inside the cabin. Okay, we're in the cabin. It's a little echoey in here, but we had originally intended to paint the ceiling, all of these pieces, and I was going to leave all these beams natural wood color just because I like looking at them, and everything else was going to be white, and we're going to do white on the walls except for the side stringer. So basically everything white except the solid wood, and then we were debating whether or not to paint the hanging knees white. But once we got the boat upside down, we came in here and started prepping it for paint, and realized how much work it was going to be to tape off all of these little squares for paint. And so we quickly came up with another plan, which is to just leave all of this alone and not paint it, which we liked that idea a lot. And instead, all we're going to do is paint the hanging knees. So that will give some white color to the ceiling, and it'll tie in the port and starboard sides, which will be white, with these with the transverse beams. So the bulkhead, the forward hanging knee, and the aft hanging knee will all be white, and then we're going to leave the ceiling alone, and that way we can paint it we can paint it once the boat is flipped upright. We don't have to do it while the boat's upside down. And also, we don't have a really good way to ventilate the boat in the garage, especially upside down. If you had some good exhaust fans and some hose, you could suck the smelly air out of the boat or pipe in fresh air. But anyway, that just avoids this. Also, we haven't coated this hanging knee yet, and so we should have done that. I would recommend pre-coating the hanging knee, and these days we're pretty much recommending people to pre-coat everything. There's almost no situation where it's not advantageous to have the parts pre-coated with epoxy before you install them, because it's just so much easier to coat a part on the workbench and then sand it on the workbench, and then once it's installed, you know, you can do a final coat of epoxy on it if you want it to end up looking glossy, epoxy, you know, just an epoxy gloss finish, or it's ready for primer. It's already sanded and ready for primer. So that's just a shot inside the cabin. It's plenty strong. I mean, you can sit down anywhere in here. Another thing that I realized is I forgot 2 deck beams. There's supposed to be a deck beam here and here, and so I'm gonna add those in while the boat's upside down. They won't be notched into the deck beams, but it doesn't really matter. They'll still support the foredeck all the way to the deck beams, and so yeah. And also this area here is where a lot of the hardware that will be later installed for the halyard and the sonator and the downhaul, and it's good to have a backing plate in that area for some of those stand-up blocks that'll be mounted there. It's not a big deal to glue in backing plates after the fact, which is what I'm going to do. So once I determine, you know, I'm going to have a block here, 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 or here, or whatever, then I'll cut out some scraps of plywood and just glue them down, and you know, probably use a fender washer. It's just good to have extra thickness there, especially on blocks where you have load that's pulling straight out of the deck. You don't want your halyard block to blow out of the deck. So fender washers and backing plates are the norm. And also, if you can screw into the deck beam itself, you know, with a long screw that has just as much or almost as much strength probably as a through bolt in that situation. And so turning around here, I'll just give you a quick view of the other section here. There's the compartment on the let's see, that's the port side of the boat. And the other side has the cooler, of course. And here is underneath the bridge deck. So there's a shot of my butt block. And there's a centerboard trunk, and there's the ballast tank. And so none of my lids are glued on to my ballast tank yet, of course. There's a shot in the cockpit. And you know, you can see in all these places. Here's underneath my cabin hatch, or my bunk tops, I should say. And so this kind of shows some of the squeeze out cleanup that I did when I glued my seat tops down.